This is the Overton Pod. Happy New Year. Welcome to the podcast. Kanthan, how are you?
I'm fit and fabulous as always, John.
Really?
And a Happy New Year to you as well.
Yes.
And to all of our fabulous fans out there.
Fans.
And
have we picked up another two? Are we up to 14?
I think we're up to 14.
Are we up to 14? That's very good. Lovely. So we move into
But
the
they
new
hit
year.
that like, subscribe button already, you see. So
We have 14 subscribers.
we have 14 subscribers.
Superb.
Now, this
superb.
is good. Yeah.
I mean, that is 10 more than News 24.
Yeah. So, look, the EFF is trying to get those 14 people cancelled. But let's see.
Yes. Okay, so a lot has happened in the first kind of 10 days of 2026. And
Yes, there are times when decades happen in weeks.
yes, exactly. Didn't someone famous say that once?
Yeah, and I think it was years happen in a day or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I can't remember who it was, but someone will write it in the comments. So let's get to those things because I think they're the most topical things to discuss. 3rd of January, there seemed like, because I was awake when all this stuff was going on, and on X, there seemed like there was some sort of military stuff going on in Venezuela, but it didn't seem like this big thing. It almost appeared initially as if what was happening was the Americans had sent some helicopters into Caracas and were bombing military installations, mainly the main base that's there. And I went, oh, okay. But it was like a couple of helicopters flying across the sky. I was like, no big deal. And didn't think too much of it. And then within a couple of hours, obviously, it was announced by Donald Trump that the United States had arrested and captured Nicolas Maduro.
Use the word kidnapped. Trump is very happy with the word kidnapped. He says, yeah, I like that. Let's use kidnapped.
Yeah, I think that's I know for a fact legally that's the wrong terminology.
Yes.
But whatever. I don't really care. I mean, the truth is if you think he kidnapped a sitting head of state,
So,
which he didn't do, but
look,
if you think he did that,
I'd like to, just recall our last conversation of last year when we were talking about the resurrection of the Monroe Doctrine.
yes.
And I said at the time, Venezuela is going to fall. And the question of how quickly it was going to happen was really the thing that was up for grabs. So what I had envisaged was that there would be a blockade that would continue for some time. And eventually you would have Maduro saying, all right, I surrender. What do you want from me? And let's take it from there. I was not expecting this. I've got to say that the last time I had chuckled so heartily at an operation was when we had the pager incident. And, it was something along those lines. It was just so completely left field that I don't think that anyone had actually foresawn that this was going to happen.
Well, when was the last time that kind of thing happened? You'd have to probably go back to Noriega.
Well, yeah, Panama.
And that was a bit of a different scenario because there were already hostilities occurring and protests in the streets, etc. It was a little bit of a different scenario. This was, America's not happy with Venezuela, but America really hasn't been happy with Venezuela for 20 years. And Venezuela says their usual sort of standard socialist communist rhetoric in response, and that's sort of it. You didn't expect that out of the blue they would send in Delta Force and just extract the guy in the middle of the night.
But I did expect that the U.S. was going to ensure that whatever regime is sitting in Venezuela is going to be very firmly on the side of the United States.
Okay, I want to discuss that, but before we get to that, I want to go through some of the usual. The ship went into the bridge as some giant conspiracy plan because there's, of course, with this we must have giant conspiracies again. We can't just have things as they are or as we see them. So where are you at the moment? Because I feel like you fell down a rabbit hole. Are you? Let me tell you where I am. I am the Americans use superior military power to jam signals and prevent their helicopters from being shot down, although there was some fire at their helicopters. In fact, one was hit but not taken out. And then they landed a whole bunch of Delta Force on the roof of the building where Maduro was, and then they proceeded to kill all of his security and extract him. Then they got back on their helicopters, flew back out the country, and that was that. Now, I know there's a whole bunch of conspiracy theories. What part of that do you think is wrong?
None of that is wrong.
Okay.
But the part that I think that people are failing to take into account is that there was a lot of preparation that Team Trump had done ahead of time. They definitely had people on the ground who had every conceivable interest to actually get Maduro out of office. I have no doubt that money actually changed hands. And
why do you have no doubt of that?
I have no
Why
doubt
do you
about
have no
that.
doubt?
Simply because of the fact that everything fell into place so smoothly after the Americans left. There you have the vice president then effectively kowtowing to every single one of the demands. There wasn't even a question of discussion about it. It was almost as though, all right, this is now going all according to plan. So in terms of superior technology, I'm 100% there with you. But at the same time, am I also very clear that there was no incentive whatsoever among the people in Maduro's immediate inner circle. And when I say inner circle, I'm talking about the Venezuelans. Because remember that Maduro did not trust his own people. Mm-hmm. Maduro surrounded himself with Cubans. Mm-hmm. The Americans took out all of the Cubans. Mm-hmm. Is it likely that the Venezuelans are actually fond of the Cubans? I don't think so. So my view is that Trump actually negotiated this behind the scenes well in advance. Remember that the timing around how they ended up getting Maduro before he could get into his enclosure, they had come prepped with thermite to burn into the enclosure.
They had, but they also admitted that they had spies on the inside. But,
exactly,
but American spies, not Venezuelan spies. CIA people, actual members of the CIA, not informants, actual CIA spies. So those are Americans. But I hear you. I agree to a point. I just want to try and separate this out because having planned it in advance, the problem with is how much of it has been planned. So I'm on page with saying that perhaps US officials had gone to certain people, like the person who's now taken over, Rodriguez, and said to her, listen, Maduro ain't going to make it. We're not going to tell you how. We're not going to tell you when. We're just going to tell you he ain't going to make it. And when he doesn't make it, we're happy that you take over, but these are the rules. And she said, okay. And if you're saying that's what happened,
that's what I'm
in complete agreement.
That's pretty much what I'm saying.
If there's the conspiracy that people in Venezuela knew the exact operation was going to happen.
No, not at all.
And
Absolutely
they turned
not.
off Russian missile launches and things, I am completely not on that page. And I think that as the time has passed, I think that those theories, which came up immediately, obviously, have been even more disproven by actions not of the Venezuelans, by the way, by actions of the Russians, which we must get into a little bit later, and by actions of the Chinese. You can see military actions and movements happening across the globe in response to that operation that took place in Venezuela, which indicates to me, at least, and I'm happy to get into it, but I want to stick on Venezuela, but it indicates to me that that operation was incredibly successful solely as an American operation, not as, some sort of conspiratorial other things taking place.
No, you're not going to get any argument from me there.
In fact, it's amazing we're on the same page.
In fact, the meticulous detail that the Americans went into when planning this operation, they literally built an exact replica model of...
Unbelievable.
This is, top tier stuff. They rehearsed this thing over and over and again for months.
I also have to say that I saw in the wake of this is obviously, everyone's got an opinion, but there are some people online who are really interesting because you do have former Delta Force soldiers. And you obviously Navy SEALs, and there was a bit of a funny thing that happened between Navy SEALs and Delta Force because there's a lot of rivalry there. And when it happened, the Delta Force guys were all saying, thank goodness this was Delta Force. Otherwise, there would already be a New York Times bestseller book all about it because the new Navy SEAL guys can't shut up. But
there was this interesting thing that the New York Times then published a story saying we actually had leaked information,
yes,
but we chose
not to go with it.
I'm kind of skeptical about that.
I'm also skeptical.
But it's okay. I'll give them credit for wanting to pretend to have some
the back of their country,
some type of patriotism. Frankly, I don't think that.
No, but some of the stuff. One of the videos I saw that was released and was explained by this guy who's former Special Forces, just of a Delta Force doing a practice drill and storming a property with like a farmhouse and just going in room by room and clearing it of enemies, and the speed at which this all happens and the efficiency of them is quite unbelievable. So, I think when people were also like, oh, that's not possible, Americans didn't lose anyone. And I need to say that as far as we know, 6 people on the American side were injured. So it's not that no one took any kind of fire. It's just that they are so good at what they do and so well trained. And I think it was a truly incredible operation. I think let's talk about the arguments around, you brought up kidnapping. No,
I'm using Trump's word.
I know, but why would you explain to people who might still be like, okay, but he shouldn't have, it's international law, Kanthan. He can't take the sitting head of state and just kidnap him in the middle of the night. Why is that not a good argument?
So in 2022, there was a grand jury indictment against Maduro for drug trafficking.
I'm going to correct you. There was one in 2022, you're right. But there was the original indictment against Maduro was in 2014. That's why the judge who's presiding over the case is 92 years old.
Right.
They didn't assign it to him now. They would never have assigned him this kind of case at 92. They assigned it to him in 2014, 11 years ago, when he was 81 years old. Okay? And so it's been on his table, on his books, since 2014, and every time they add something.
So the grand jury indictment was 2022. I'm happy to accept that there was a prior indictment that was actually pulled together, but the basis on which this operation was launched was based on the 2022 indictment. There was a substantial body of evidence implicating Maduro in all sorts of drug-related offenses primarily, but also overall attempts to destabilize the U.S. This operation was primarily a law enforcement operation in terms of U.S. law. And it was effectively an FBI operation in order to bring an indicted criminal to justice.
And DEA, because it's drug-related.
Yes. And the role of Delta Force and its like was there in a support capacity, which again is completely legal under American law.
And I also think it's important to point out that neither the United States nor the European Union nor several other countries, including several countries in South America, had recognized Maduro's last election victory. So they did not view him...
Yes, except I don't want to muddy the waters by conflating that. Look,
I think when people say, look, they took out a president, from their perspective, they're going to argue he wasn't the president.
I understand that. And what I'm saying is that, do I believe that Maduro stole the last election? Yes, I do. In exactly the same way I believe that Joe Biden stole the 2020 election from Donald Trump. So, the body of evidence is quite overwhelming. But the reason for taking him out is not because he stole the election.
Of course not, no.
Yeah, the reason for taking him out is because of the fact that there is an indictment against him.
I just want to combat this international law thing, because I think, firstly, if you believe in international law, which I don't, but if you believe in international law, then you can't do what they did, according to international law. But if he's not the president of the country, if he's not the legitimate president of the country, then all he is he becomes a standard citizen of that country. And then if he has drug trafficked across borders, as is the claim, then he can be actually picked up, like Interpol would pick up a wanted criminal across Europe or anywhere in the world, in fact. So I hope
most people... So you recognize Interpol?
Well, it's a longer discussion. Let's not get into it.
All right.
I think here's what I'll say about which kind of will answer the Interpol question. International law is firstly made up, but it's also only as useful, even in the fact that it's made up, because lots of things are made up.
As your
but it's
ability
only
to enforce it.
as your ability to enforce it.
Yes.
Right. So the truth is you can make all the laws you like. At the end of the day, if you can't enforce those laws are meaningless, even if you believe in them very deeply. And so that's the truth about international law, is most of it's unenforceable. A lot of it conflicts with the laws of countries, so therefore it essentially becomes null and void. Most of it, not most of it, but plenty of it is almost passed as resolution at the United Nations level, which has very little actual bearing. As we know, there's only one international court in The Hague, and they essentially go after large-scale human rights abuses. That's really what they've been used for. They haven't been used...
But it's been weaponized very specifically.
Oh, completely. Yeah. We are on that same page. But what I'm saying is you don't see someone in The Hague, you're not going to find someone who's bringing Zimbabweans over the border into South Africa illegally, right? Which is against international law, by the way. You're not going to see them in The Hague. You're not going to see Cyril Ramaphosa in The Hague because he signed the expropriation without compensation bill, which, by the way, is against international law. You're not going to see Cyril Ramaphosa in The Hague. So, it's obviously been weaponized, as you say, and it's very selective, but it's because international law is essentially meaningless. Okay, so that's great that we're on the same page on that part of Venezuela. You've sort of outlined this already. I want to understand how it is that America don't have any, inverted commas, boots on the ground, not formally, okay? They must have people, but they don't have soldiers, guarding the judiciary and the parliament and, who's in charge now. And Venezuela, is it much better for the people so far? Doesn't seem to be. Okay, in other words, not too much has changed.
At a very practical level, you've had large numbers of political prisoners being released.
Mm-hmm.
So when the Americans say that has been happening, I believe that is the case. I think what people need to understand is that there's a mind shift that has actually happened in terms of the Americans. And a lot of people have been saying that Trump has now become a neocon. And they don't understand the difference between a neocon and the type of thing that Trump is doing. So,
neocon, from my perspective, has always been a dumb word, because the problem with it is that the original sort of definition of it was that you had this new branch of conservatives. The neocons were literally people in the government of the United States at the time of Bush. And these were people who were very big on war and wanted to go to war with the world. And so they were called basically the neocons. The problem is that 20 years later, what's happened is that term is used to describe anyone I don't agree with who does anything that is other than isolationist.
Well, I think we can use a very specific example of what was a neocon operation, and that was Iraq. Mm-hmm. So the regime change that took place in Iraq was very much a neocon operation. It was a proper war. Excuse me. A very expensive war, of course, but there was a business model for the war. And the business model is, we're going to go in, we're going to wage war, we're going to do a regime change, then we're going to have boots on the ground to then protect our assets, and we will then use those assets to then enrich ourselves and very specific strategic partners that we pulled in. But you and I know that as a business model, taking out a regime is very easy. Occupation is expensive and
impossible.
Because
the concept behind occupation is that you have to change the minds. See, it's not about, you can put boots on the ground, you can have people with weapons, you can restrict movement, you can do all kinds of things. But the problem is you cannot change people's minds, right? That comes over time, either by some sort of propaganda and manipulation, which the Americans didn't try or tried.
Well,
very
you need
poorly.
shared values, basically, John.
Well,
And-
they have
and
to.
if you
They have
don't-
to agree with
yeah.
you being there, basically.
Yes, exactly, and that's what I mean by shared values.
Exactly. You put it better than I did. Yeah. So carry on. I mean, go for it.
So on that basis, if you take Iraq as a very specific example, it was long, it was costly. There were a lot of people who got rich out of Iraq, by the way. Don't get me wrong on this, but at the same time, it was very costly in terms of personnel. It was very costly in terms of the political implications that went with having American troops getting killed on foreign soil. And eventually they pulled out, as inevitably happens in these particular cases. The business model that we are seeing right now is you actually need to go back to before the Cuban Revolution. And you need to look at Batista. And, the expression that was used at the time, I don't remember who it was who first said it, but it was, he may be a bastard, but he's our bastard. And if you now apply the same business model in terms of what is happening in Venezuela, you'll see exactly where Trump's headspace is coming from. He's saying, I'm not committing American troops to being on the ground. There's not going to be any body bags that are coming out of any foreign country to make me look bad. Am I going to use superior American technology whenever possible to enforce my will upon the rest of the world? Absolutely yes. And so the scenario that you've got right now, everyone said he's going to put Machado in, and he said no. And his logic is absolutely sound, because the entire state security apparatus in Venezuela is very firmly in the hands of the Bolivarians. I mean, they were trained by Chavez, and they have infiltrated every aspect of the public service. It's like, tomorrow if you try and have...
Helen Ziller in Johannesburg is exactly what I discussed on the previous podcast.
Well, yes.
You either have to be willing to completely purge all of these people.
Well,
And in the Venezuelan case, purging is something, it's not just firing them. You've got to arrest them,
Quite right.
imprison them.
So in the context that you discussed around Johannesburg, which I agree with, it's very easy for you to go in and fire all of the heads of department and be able to immediately replace them with competent people who will follow the instructions of the executive. That's not something that you can actually do in terms of Venezuela. Remember, Venezuela has 7 million people who fled the country. It's a massive amount. I mean, just think of the sheer displacement. I can't think of any other scenario where the numbers of people who have fled a country have been as huge as that. 7 million. It's massive. And I would say without hesitation, that's the intellectual capital of the country that actually fled. Because, why would you stick around and, have to join a communist bread queue when you can actually go to other parts of the world and apply your intellectual capital and end up doing great things? We saw exactly the same thing happen in the context of the Cubans who fled in the wake of Castro and ended up being very prosperous. Obviously, lots of them also got into drugs and things like that. But by and large, these were the high intellectual capital people that ended up fleeing. So Trump sets a very public example of American technology. And by the way, I'm fascinated by what the reports are coming in around the sonic weapons that we used.
Yeah, just be careful around that. There's one report, and that report is basically the same as when your grandmother forwards things on WhatsApp. So the origin of that, I looked into it because, and the reason I looked into it is because I listened to what the guy had said about the symptoms that the people suffered. That didn't sound right, okay, for a sonic weapon. So vomiting blood, for example, okay. Where's the logic in that?
I wouldn't say it's vomiting blood, but would they have nosebleeds necessarily?
Yeah, so the nosebleed stuff can work, and the coughing up. So let me just explain that maybe that happened, and maybe they use sonic weapons. It's neither confirmed nor denied. However, the origin of it is a single voice note, someone on a voice note saying that they were a god of sorts, and that they were around, but somehow not harmed. And that this is what happened.
So take the view that sonic weapons have been in development in many parts of the world for the longest time. So have they actually been put into actual operation before? No. Is there a possibility in this particular case that, yes, the Americans have worked on it and developed it and were able to equip this team with it? I think there's a strong possibility. But I don't want to get too hung up on it. I'm very happy to take your point of view around this. I think
it may have happened, it may not
yeah.
have.
But again, it's something that I'm going to be researching with a great deal of interest because, every time new weapons tech comes along, I generally, go digging into it. Interestingly, one of the things that I went into researching after this little exercise was how to make thermite. And the useful thing about thermite, by the way, just so that people understand where it comes from, is because thermite burns based on its own oxygen supply, you can't actually smother it by removing the oxygen from the environment. See, it's why, for example, you can use thermite underwater. And thermite is surprisingly easy to make, John.
Yes.
Just
maybe we'll leave it there.
Yeah,
not go any further.
Not going any further. So is napalm, by the way, but that's again a discussion for another day.
Love the smell of napalm in the morning.
So very good example has now been set in terms of Maduro, and then people turn around and say, what about Colombia and Trump
and Cuba?
No, but they said very specifically.
They said Colombia. They said he should watch himself.
Yeah, and Trump said, and then guess what? The Colombian president is now making a visit to the White House. Okay, discussions will no doubt take place.
Well, Cuba, he's also mentioned. So I think what's interesting is, all right, maybe we stop moving away from Venezuela, but I just want to point out what's happened. So the new president, as you've mentioned, has come online and is basically acceding to all of the Americans' demands. Essentially, America is Venezuela's new oil partner. That's basically what's happened. America is going to basically put all the money into refining and digging the oil out, essentially. So they're going to take all of their stuff back because that was stolen from them in an expropriation without compensation move. So if you want to see and I've always said, South Africa, if you want to look into South Africa's future, its worst possible future, Venezuela is it. So America is now going to sort of take Venezuela's oil. They're going to pay them for it, but they're going to benefit from it. So they're going to be the first to benefit, and they're going to be the first to sell it on. So if China wants Venezuelan oil, that's great, but they're going to buy it from the United States importantly, US dollars.
In US dollars. And if you want to understand the logic behind where this is going to, you have to recognize that for the longest time, the US dollar was the world's reserve currency, unassailable simply because of the fact that you could only buy petroleum. And everyone was happy to use it, by and large. Well, put it this way, no one complained. Until Joe Biden became president, and he very stupidly ended up weaponizing the dollar, which suddenly meant that you had the scramble from other parts of the world where people said, I do not want the Americans suddenly deciding that they're going to take my dollars, so I now need to have a backup plan. And that's when you saw things like the idea of a BRICS currency and all of those things come into play. You already have the situation where Russia and India have been trading between themselves in their own currencies. Russia and China are trading in their own currencies. And India and China, to some extent, are also now trading in their own currencies, all of which does everything to undermine the hegemony of the dollar. And what Trump is effectively doing by this action is told the Chinese, look, I'm going to honor all of the contracts that the Venezuelans have in place with you for supply of oil. And just, interesting bits of figures on this, by the way. 80% of Venezuela's oil goes to China. In terms of the amount of oil that China uses, it's about 3% of China's oil. But effectively, China has been keeping the Venezuelan economy active because of the fact that they've been buying the Venezuelan oil. And of course, they pay in yuan, which means, the money then gets used to trade with China. And Trump's effectively put a stop to that.
Yeah.
Remember that Trump had also put a stop to the Chinese presence in Panama because the Chinese were effectively gatekeepers of the Panama Canal.
Yeah.
So all of these.
So there's that's fallen into place, and then you've also got Colombia, as you mentioned, and Cuba. Now, Cuba is a bit of an interesting scenario because Trump's not selling Venezuelan oil to Cuba, and that is the main supplier of Cuba.
Well, they effectively kept the Cuban economy alive.
Yes, and Cuba has 4 days of reserve oil. So in a week of denying, if you deny Cuba all oil supply for a week, they run out of all oil, which is the way they run their entire economy because they will have no energy, essentially. I think it would be very surprising not to see, and this is what's interesting about the regime change, and this is why a few months ago, I think we mentioned on the podcast, I didn't like that terminology either, because regime change again can mean many different things. And so when people freak out about regime change, they all like to highlight things like Saddam Hussein, and they like to highlight Muammar Gaddafi. And, you know, they like to highlight these failures of regime change, which looked completely different. They were not plucking a leader out in the middle of the night, making sure that the people who followed him understood their place in the world, and then making sure that commercial interests fell into place. They were bombs, you know, shock and awe, as if those of you old enough to remember that in Iraq. So,
and then when they pulled out, there was chaos.
Yes, and so look, I think it will be interesting to see, because I think what we might see in Cuba, for example, may not be a change of leader. And in fact, we must get to Iran, but you've seen Trump trying to do similar things in Iran, trying to be like, look, I don't care who runs your country. I do not really care who puts tar on the roads and who runs the tax service. It doesn't bother me. I'm not interested in doing that. So he's not trying to do regime change like that. He's trying to do regime change in terms of change of behavior, in which he goes, you can still be in charge. I don't really care, but you'd have to change the way you behave.
Look, frankly, in the case of Iran, it's not going to be possible unless the Ayatollahs are out. Mm-hmm. But it just isn't.
Because of the religious fundamentalism.
Yes. Because of the fact that you don't have a functional society when you have effectively someone who's able to come in and override any decisions that get taken by the electoral processes within that society, simply because they say so. Mm. And so I think we'll get into Iran at some point, because
we will, yeah. Let's stick on the Donroe Doctrine.
Yeah, but let's stick on the Donroe. And you know, again, people are saying this almost disparagingly, you know, the Donroe Doctrine.
Well, he said it himself, so it's not disparaging at all. He thinks it's hilarious.
But the reason why they're saying it disparagingly is because he does have this ability to take everything and make it about himself. And
yes.
And you know, I think props to him, because no one else is going to give him credit, so he might as well give himself the credit.
Sure.
Right? I mean, you know, why not eventually take over the Nobel Committee, and then
well,
you know,
Norway might be at war shortly. Not Norway, Denmark, but it's just over the border. So we get to Greenland just now.
But so I think that certainly Cuba. So let's watch the Colombia situation first, because I think that's significant. The other thing that people need to take into account is that the great strategic interest that the U.S. had in taking out Maduro is that Maduro was doing saber-rattling about moving into Guyana.
Not only saber-rattling, he had basically tried already to annex a large part of Guyana.
Correct.
And that part, roughly, they estimate, is something like 1 trillion barrels of oil or something ridiculous. In the coastal waters of that state.
Yes, but
which he was trying to annex.
But more to the point, there are already American companies on the ground out there. So ExxonMobil is there, and he's basically protecting, again, U.S. interests in that part of the world. So with simply taking out Maduro, he's done two things. The one is he's guaranteed the safety of the companies that are operating out there and the flow of oil that's going to come from there. He's also, at the same time, remove the ability of the Chinese to exert a sphere of influence in Latin America. And I think that you are going to see after the meeting with Colombia's president that there's going to be an agreement that says, yes, we are now very firmly on the side of Team US. Yes, we are very firmly going to be taking every step possible to get rid of the cocaine cartels. We are going to ensure that our borders are closed, all of that good stuff. And you're also going to see some things very similar happening in the context of Mexico.
Yeah, Mexico will be interesting. It has to be understood that in Mexico, the cartels are the government. There really is no real line there.
And I think the best way to put it is that the government exists with the permission of the cartels.
So the cartels are the Ayatollah too,
yes.
in that scenario. And I think what's more likely to happen in Mexico is that the cartels Trump's going to go after cartels militarily.
Yes.
With, I think, excessive force. And he's going to
define excessive force, John.
He's going to destroy them. If you are currently a cartel member in an area or a village, expect to die in the next year.
Yeah, look, I can't see a scenario where he's bombing villages. Okay, but
not villages, but he's certainly taking out all kind of cartel members.
I'm reminded of the conversation that he had with the leader of the Taliban back in the day, where he produced a picture of the guy's home and said, effectively, I know where you live. I can take you out anytime if you don't play by my rules. Of course, Biden screwed that up as well. So certainly Colombia, Mexico, where there's going to be military interventions. But I think Cuba will capitulate on the basis of a complete economic shutdown in the absence of energy. Because how do you survive?
Yes, and also I think it's important to remember that Cuba, while the leadership there is very much in the mold of the Castros, the reality is that they aren't the Castros. And that at the end of the day, there is probably more possibility for shift there. And I think that may very well happen. And so potentially without too much firing of any weapons, you're going to see a South American Cuban situation, which by the end of Trump's term essentially represents what the EU is to the United States in a similar kind of way.
Yes.
We don't love you, but we are allies. We work together in our own interests. And so I think that's really a phenomenal change. You say decades happen in days. It is a phenomenal change because the screaming and shouting you get from some smart people, Tony Leon types. Tony Leon wrote a whole diatribe in the wake of this. Of course, Tony doesn't like Maduro, so at least he's sensible enough to say that this is a bad guy. But he hates Trump almost equally, right? So he cannot possibly give Trump any credit, or he can't see any positive in Trump's way of doing things. The funny thing, though, is that he can see the positives in the outcomes. He just doesn't like how you get there. It's a very interesting thing about people who are all about words and people who are about actions. Sometimes it's, doing the right thing is doing the hard thing. As I said to someone the other day in regards to what we need to do in South Africa with crime. I think Trump has a very interesting vision for that. I want to talk the other piece of this puzzle, because that's the Southern Hemisphere dealt with. The Northern Hemisphere is Greenland and Canada, but Greenland. Canada is going to self-destruct. Canada is in very big trouble. We don't need to get into it too much, but essentially they've had pretty much zero growth for 10 years. We know what that's like. It's not a good place to be. They've had very large amounts of immigration, which have pushed up housing costs and healthcare costs. They obviously have a socialized medicine country and a socialized everything else in many ways, like, daycare and all these kinds of things which are partially subsidized. They're in big trouble because if you're growing, you can afford to pay for those kinds of things. You make money, and so you've got extra cash. If you're not growing, but you're also increasing those expenses, which is what they've done for more than a decade, and aren't stopping, you're in trouble. So Canada's in big trouble, and I think that Trump will continue to allow them to detonate. There is a side effect of what's happened with the Venezuela thing, which is that before Venezuela, America's oil came from America and Canada. And then obviously they got nothing from South America, basically. And they preferred not to buy from the East. So they did sometimes buy from the Saudis, but they preferred to supply their own. So like in Trump's first term, they became a net exporter. But all of that oil was American and Canadian. If you remember, on the first day of Biden's term, he shut down the Keystone Pipeline and killed 40,000 jobs, I think, instantaneously. And that meant that instead of just letting oil move through a pipeline between the United States,
it was all being trucked,
and America, all the way down to the Gulf, it all gets trucked or shipped, which obviously is far more dangerous and bad for the environment and all those lovely things. Now that the Americans will have Venezuelan oil, they don't need Canadian oil at all, and so Canada may be in a little bit more trouble, because if America says no thanks, you can keep it.
I haven't run the numbers on that yet. So, certainly in the context of the type of oil that comes out of Venezuela right now, it's not as easy to get high quality gasoline from the type of crude that you get from Venezuela. Diesel, absolutely. But, so I don't think that the Canadian situation is going to be quite as drastic as that. But at the same time, remember that the U.S. is in a position to also replace the Canadian oil supply by making use of fracking and all of that other stuff, correct, which is significantly more efficient, by the way, than refining Venezuelan oil. Which again I come back to in the basis of it's not about the Venezuelan oil as much as the implementation of the Monroe Doctrine.
Correct. And everyone focusing on the oil was exceptionally stupid, because it obviously is a part of it, but it's not the part. On Greenland, which is where we're getting to. So Trump's first term, he makes this joke about Greenland. There's a whole bunch of memes go around. There's a Trump tower. Graphic designer puts a Trump tower in the middle of Nuuk. And it's a big joke. Everyone thinks Trump's essentially just, he's joking. He's being loud and brash, but he's joking. And he says it a couple of times in his first term, but I think he was really weighed down by the other stuff happening, and there wasn't a lot of focus on it, and so nothing happened come the end of his term. I think we need to remember that not only did Trump have the election stolen from him at the end of 2020, but he had 2020 stolen from him as well, because COVID happens, and then there's just shrieking about that for basically 9 months before the election. And nothing else happens. Remember, they shut down the government, they shut down the country. So it's very hard to do things. It was even hard to meet, as everybody knows, during that time as a result of all those restrictions. For many people, that would have been by design. Whether they designed it or not, they would have loved the fact that that's how it ended up.
Although, let's be clear that Trump was stupid enough to allow Fauci to basically dictate.
He was. But again,
and he realized that after the fact. But
he realized that after 4 weeks. But 4 weeks is not 9 months. So we can take a month away and say that was your fault, dude. But the rest, not really. Look, Greenland now comes back onto the radar, and Trump is being pretty pushy about the fact that he wants the United States to have control of Greenland.
Well, effectively they do already, because the military bases that are on Greenland are all U.S. bases.
They are. They do different things, though. So, for example, if you wanted to send a military force into the main population center, which is Nuuk, of Greenland, you wouldn't be able to do that. There aren't troops there. It's a Space Force base.
Sure.
So the reason maybe let's talk about the reason he wants Greenland. I think we've discussed it before.
Well, it's everything to do with the trade routes and
The trade routes and the route of intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Yes.
Because if you want to fire an intercontinental ballistic missile from Russia or China into the United States, the best way to do that and likely achieve success is through the Arctic Circle.
Oh, it's a great circle route, basically.
And the way that you would try and then to intercept that missile would be by trying to intercept it from Greenland. And the reason is because and I forget the exact term because it's not the arc, but essentially the top of the arc of an intercontinental ballistic missile.
The azimuth.
Yes, I think it's the azimuth. The azimuth of the ballistic missile would be over Greenland coming to the United States. And the easiest place to shoot down a missile is at that azimuth.
Sure.
And so that's a big reason of why they want control, obviously, the oceans, as you talk about not only trade routes, but also if you want to send military, a navy to the United States, to the Northern Hemisphere, doing it through the Arctic Circle, especially once the ice melts, which is rapidly kind of happening, not rapidly, but it's happening more and more, then that's the best way to do it.
Well, you don't have to have the ice melt. You can actually
send submarines.
Submarines under the ice.
True.
Because there's no continent at the North Pole.
Correct. So I think that that's the context of him wanting Greenland, but obviously there's a lot of upsetness because Denmark, which runs Greenland, says Greenland's ours and we're not giving it to you and bugger off. So what's your take?
So there's 50,000 people who live in
57,000, Kanthan.
57,000, okay. You give each of those 57,000 people $1 million. And
And create
say,
Monaco
and say in exchange for you, you telling me they won't take it? I'm pretty sure that. You see, the interesting thing in terms of Trump's shift in the conversation is he waited for Denmark to say the future of Greenland must be determined by the people of Greenland. And Trump was immediately there. Yep, that works for me.
Yes, because it's easy to bribe 57,000 people.
Yeah. Well, it's also inexpensive.
Yes.
Is my point.
For an American.
Yes.
Well, for an American president. Put
Yes.
it that way.
Especially an American president who's been raking in that type of money from doing things like selling gold cards for people to be able to live in the U.S., which has brought in, so many billions. He's got all of these tariffs which have been bringing in income, which has been bringing in so many billions. And remember that all of this is not under control of Congress. Okay, it's under control of the Treasury Secretary. And, Trump basically is able to deploy that, pretty much as he sees fit without needing to go to Congress and get oversight. And
is he going to get
stuff.
Greenland? Because it's a bit more complicated than, in some ways, it's more complicated than Venezuela or
I don't
Cuba.
think it's a question of whether he's going to get Greenland. I mean, if you look at this in geopolitical terms, he has no choice but to take Greenland. The question then is not how he gets Greenland. Not if he gets Greenland, but how he ends up getting Greenland. And I think that's a conversation that people need to be having. And it's very specifically the point that you've made. In order to ensure America's safety from ICBMs, and the shortest route from to hit the U.S. is directly over the North Pole, then yes, he absolutely needs to have control of Greenland for that reason. Yeah. He could, one could argue the same thing in terms of Canada, but Greenland's a lot more manageable. If you're taking over Canada, you effectively end up with another Democrat state, which you don't want.
Yes, and also Canada, the other thing is Greenland will never become a state. It'll become the same as what Puerto Rico is, essentially. It'll become a territory.
A territory, yes.
Guam, Puerto Rico, all these places, they're territories. They're unlikely to be states. The Dems would love them to be states because the people there would vote Dem, and they'd get 2 more senators, and so the Senate would be unassailable and all the rest of it, or close to. All right, so I think that's the American geopolitics for the first 10 days of the year, which is kind of insane. That's where we're at, and I think there's something interesting that this shows about what the Trump administration is likely to do in 2026. I think 2025 was a very internally focused year. It was let's get funding for ICE, let's set up deportation, let's close the border, let's get our military recruiting back up, let's get our military in, tell them the way we view things, that meeting that happened with Pete Hegseth. Let's get the bad people out, good people in, etc. That seemed to be last year. This year, I think, seems to be a foreign policy year. I'm not saying nothing will happen internally. There is some stuff happening internally. He's trying to address the affordability crisis because he knows he's going to lose the midterms worse. I think he's going to lose anyway, but he knows he's going to lose the midterms worse if he doesn't address that. He's already moving on that. He's moved on credit card interest, which I don't really agree with. I think it's just going to make that whole industry difficult to deal with. But he's moved on that. He wants it capped at 10%, which is dumb because you know how the credit card companies are going to act and react to that. But the second thing that he's done, which I do like, is he's turned around and he's basically saying he wants to prevent large corporations from buying single-family homes. So BlackRock has for now, better part of a decade, spent a lot of money going into small American cities and towns and literally buying up entire city blocks or several city blocks. And so what they'll do is they'll go to homeowners in an area that they can see is probably going to gentrify, for example. And they will go to those people and they'll say, they've done the calculations. They know that if they own the area, they will gentrify it. And they've done the calculations that a house in a gentrified area will be $500,000. Currently, that house is worth $150,000. And they go to the people and they say, we'll give you $250,000 for your house. And people go, wow, I win $250,000. And now the company owns that house, but they also own entire blocks. And then they redevelop and they then rent out these houses at now rentals, which are quite exorbitant, but just affordable, if that makes sense. But obviously never sell the properties, and now the properties are out of the reach of the average homeowner, right? And that's also made property prices increase in the United States because the properties they don't own also then increase, and so wages haven't kept up and all the rest of it. So he's trying to address that. We'll see. Centralizing control within the state of things like that doesn't seem like the best idea. However, centralizing control of things like that within a giant company, pretty much the largest in the world, also doesn't seem like a good idea. So I'm not for authoritarians or technocrats. But let's see how that goes. So that's what he's done internally. But I just feel like this is very much a year where he's focusing outwards. He's spoken about an expenditure of $1.5 trillion on the U.S. military. That's a 50% increase on their budget, which was already insanely high, $1 trillion a year. And so it's interesting to see that what's happening with all of that. Is there anything else we've left out or you think I haven't expounded on?
There are a couple of things that I think you haven't taken into account. Okay. The one is that the impact of the big, beautiful bill, as he called it, it's big. Is it beautiful? No, absolutely not. And there's an exorbitant amount of waste in there. However, lots of the things that are part of the big, beautiful bill, like the extension of tax relief, to families, the things like no taxes on tips, for example, all of those things will now come into effect in this year, in this calendar year. At the same time, if you look in terms of where the economic data is coming right now, there was a fairly substantial interview with Howard Lutnick Commerce Secretary, where he was outlining the business model in some detail. And I do urge people to go out there and spend an hour and a half of their time actually listening to it. It was an interview with Chamath from the All In podcast.
Was that the original one he did, or is it a new one?
This is a new one.
Okay.
Yeah, and so he drills in some detail around exactly what Trump's economic plan has been, how Trump goes about negotiating with countries around tariffs, and there's kind of an entire masterclass in terms of how Trump has actually been negotiating all of these deals around the world. But one of the interesting things that Lutnick came up with, and I've got to say, based on the figures that he was trotting out, I think there's a very strong possibility that he's correct, that he thinks that there's a strong possibility that they will hit 6% economic growth this year. Now, if that comes to pass, remember the last time we've heard of levels along that line, would have been China like 20 years ago. Of being, so
the problem with 6% is that we like to talk about it in South Africa. We'd like 6% growth. In reality, we need about 10% growth per year for 6 years, and that would largely solve our poverty problem. But I think to understand that, though, is, things get reduced into percentages to make things easier, because you don't have to talk in these giant numbers, and it also speaks to that specific thing. The American economy, Trump took it over from Biden, negative 0.5% growth.
Yes.
Then about 3.5%, then about 4.5%, and now they're predicting over 5% when it's calculated for the end of this last quarter, ending December. That'll come out in February probably. But
except they are going to have a dip for the last quarter because of the fact that there was a shutdown.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how much, because they're still predicting over 5%, which would be more than the third quarter, which blew the lights out. And I think I want people to understand that growth that Trump had in those 3 quarters, let's assume that this last one is at least 5%. If that is the case, the growth that he had in that time is equivalent to 10 South African economies.
Yes.
Okay, so he basically grew the American economy the same as growing South Africa by 1,000%. It is, so that is that growth we talk about that we would need to eliminate poverty. He did that for the he did that equivalent. He didn't do it in the United States because obviously it's a bigger population and there's a lot more moving pieces. But the amount of growth that is for a country of that size economy with that many people, it's just astonishing. It really is unbelievable for them to be able to be growing at that rate. And I mean, if he continues that.
So, but again, you see, the interesting thing is going to be the extent to which he's going to be able to translate that into real benefits for his voting base. And that's going to be the tricky part of the puzzle. I think that you've already seen an uptick in terms of real wages for the first time. Remember that the last time that they had this uptick in real wages was in Trump's previous term. And then all of those gains got undone during the Biden administration. Now, there's also a knock-on effect from the fact that Trump is effectively getting all of the illegal immigrants out as quickly as he possibly can. The impact of illegal immigrants on American earnings in a real sense has been huge. So if you have a company that is paying, let's say, $15 to $20 an hour to their employees, and there's a competitor that they're dealing with that's paying, $6.50 to $7 an hour to illegal immigrants, and there's just no way that you can end up competing with it. It's kind of like what we've spoken about with the South African textile industry, where we had workers that were earning $2 an hour. The Chinese have workers that are earning $2 a day. We just can't compete. So by closing that off, he's forcing reemployment of American workers. we saw that uptick. I think it was something like 400,000 jobs in the last job report that were added. And a lot of people had been making a big deal about the fact that there had been job losses under the Trump administration. Yes, they were. The job losses were he was firing people in government.
Yeah.
And, so if you took the overall number of people that had been fired from government and you...
Or left government.
Yeah, or ended up leaving government because they were basically given a payoff. And you contrast that with the number of private sector jobs that were added, they're in a relatively good space. So also at the same time, there are now all of these crackdowns that are suddenly coming around all of the waste, fraud, and abuse that has been going on at the state level.
Yeah.
Is there likely to be prosecution of Tim Walz? I think that there's a great deal of effort right now on the part of the Trump administration to bring one high-profile Democrat to trial for criminality. And I think that Walz is a likely candidate. Now, let's say if Walz does end up going down as a result of this. Are they likely to go after Gavin Newsom? I think the answer to that, again, yes, because, the waste, fraud, and abuse in California is probably 100 times more. Simply if you compare the economy of Minnesota with the economy of California.
Yeah.
In terms of the sheer amounts of money. And also, is he likely to try and push through voter ID laws before the next elections?
He's trying.
And is there a possibility that he can get it through? So I'm saying that there are all of these pieces of the puzzle that I'm pretty sure that these guys are working flat out on all of these pieces simultaneously. So under normal circumstances, yes, I would say that he's going to lose the midterms. In terms of the current scenario, I'm not that sure, because voter ID is going to make a huge difference if he's able to actually swing that. So I think 6% economic growth is a possibility. I would say a probability if they continue on the current trajectory. What could undermine it? There's a court case to determine whether or not he's able to continue with his tariff policy.
Supreme Court's going to be deciding that quite soon.
Yes.
Within the next couple of days, actually. By the time this podcast releases, they may have decided it. The smart money, so to speak, is on the Supreme Court ruling against him and saying, in fact, that he may not use tariffs the way he has, and that is a power of Congress. I actually don't think the Supreme Court's going to say that. I think the Supreme Court's going to say that it is not, it's basically the Congress must pass a law one way or the other.
Yes.
If they don't want the president to have those powers, then they need to basically pass law against that.
I tend to agree with your perspective.
Although they will probably rebuke Trump in some respects in terms of how he's used it and that it's war powers and that type of stuff. And so, it'll be interesting. I think they're going to try find a middle of the road instead of outright saying you can't do this.
You see, the single significant thing that one needs to take into account is that does he have the power currently to sanction a country in its entirety without permission from Congress? In other words, you're not allowed to trade with the U.S. at all. And the answer to that is yes. So on the one hand, you have the Democrats saying, yes, he has the power to do that, but no, he can't actually put in place a version that says you are going to trade with us if you do the following things and give us this amount of money, which makes no sense whatsoever.
Yes, it's either all or nothing on that kind of power. It's not half pregnant or you're either pregnant or not.
Right.
It's one or the other. Okay. I think that's an interesting throw forward to the midterms, and I think people should maybe listen to that more than once in terms of all the things you've laid out, because there's a couple of, as you say, puzzle pieces that fit together. And I agree, if they get all of that right, there's a chance that the Republicans keep the House, control of the House. That would be ideal. Remember, if they don't, Trump's being impeached January 2027. You can take that to the bank. If they lose the midterms, January 2027, Trump gets impeached, time number one. And we're just going to keep doing that.
Yeah, look, they can try to impeach him in the House, but
and they won't.
but
They'll impeach him in the House, and it'll go to the Senate, and it'll never pass.
They won't have a supermajority in the Senate.
100% agreed. So it'll become meaningless, but that's going to be the news cycle. You see, again, and I've said it on the show many times, is it's all about narrative. It really doesn't matter what the truth is. Hopefully people who watch us, the 14 that do, or listen, they listen because they want a perspective that they think is valuable. Both you and I come here to talk about what we see as reality. We're not trying to make things up for the sake of it. But that's not true of the mainstream media. And so there's most of the stuff is narrative. So you see this going on again and again and again. This latest ICE shooting of this domestic terrorist, the woman who tried to run over the cop. That's just another version of them throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping this time it'll stick. Things in his first term that stuck were Russiagate, for example. For most of his first term, many people who watched CNN and the likes believed that Trump was a stooge of Vladimir Putin. That all got they won Pulitzer Prizes for publishing articles on that, the New York Times and Washington Post. It all turned out to be completely, utterly fake, not in line with reality at all. So there are...
Sorry, one more thing that I must point out that we haven't touched on, which is in the context of California very specifically.
Yeah.
And there's an initiative on... so California is one of these states where you can gather, I think it's something like 100,000 signatures, and you can then put an initiative onto the state ballot for the elections. Yeah, okay, right. Well, okay, whatever the figure is. But there is this initiative that says we want a tax on billionaires. But it is not a tax on the earnings of billionaires. It is a tax on the assets of billionaires. Okay, so in other words, you, John, own a house. Okay, and let's say the house is worth R1 million.
This is libel in South Africa, Kanthan. I don't own any land on purpose.
All right. So, but let's use as an example.
Yes, now I got you.
If you own a house, okay, and they say, well, the house has a value of R1 million, so we are going to impose a tax on you that's based on the value of the house. And we say it's not much. We're just going to hit you with a 5% tax on the value. Except, of course, from your perspective, the house has no value until such time as you sell the house.
Yes, correct.
Right, at which point it's actually a realized gain. But in the meanwhile, it just happens to be an investment that is...
So they tax you 50,000 rand.
Yes.
Which you don't have.
Which you don't have.
You don't actually have that money. You just have this asset which you live in.
It's not income that's being...
So now you've got to pay them 50,000, which you don't have. But it gets worse than that, because what they want to do in California is, for example, and if you look at the guys who own Google, Sergey Brin and Larry Page.
So they've pulled out.
Well, they have, California. But I want to tell you why. The reason is that they have a 3% ownership of Google each.
Yes.
Very small percentage ownership of Google. Still makes them billionaires.
Yes.
And tens of billionaires.
But they have a supermajority of voting shares.
But they have a supermajority of voting shares. They're 3% times by 10. So they each together control 60% of Google in terms of decisions that are made at a board level.
California wants to pack.
So California says, we're not going to tax you 3%. We're going to tax you.
We're not going to tax you 5% of 3%.
Yes.
We're going to tax you 5% of 60%.
That's right. And so as a result, what that would mean, by the way, is that it's not even 5% of 60%. It works out to half of what they're actually worth in net worth. But remember, they're not actually worth that, because they're only worth that because they own those shares.
Yes.
And those shares sit on a stock market, and they don't actually have that money. If you were to go and put a gun to the guy's head right now and said, transfer me, you're worth $60 billion, transfer me $60 billion right now or you die, he would die, because he doesn't actually have 60 billion in a bank account anywhere. Far be it from leftists to understand anything related to money or finance. And so, as you've said, what these guys have done is they've registered offices outside of state, so in Texas or Florida or other areas of the United States, and they are now going to make the argument if that ruling passes, they're going to make the argument that their primary business,
But they've already relocated, yes. So
their primary business prior to the 1st of January, because the law will be backdated to even though the law only gets voted on in November, it will be backdated to the 1st of January 2026. So these guys have all fled California as of the 31st of December 2025. According to Chamath, I think again, he says more than $1 trillion of wealth have left California. Now,
well, I'm inclined to believe that, because if you just simply use Google as a very specific example,
it's about $150 billion between them, I think.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And Elon's gone.
Yes.
And he's like $400 billion. Mm-hmm. And then you've got like the likes of David Sachs and all of his mates, and they're worth hundreds of millions each.
Yep.
Right. So that's billions altogether.
Yeah.
So
Chamath has gone as well.
Chamath has gone. All those guys have gone, right?
Well. Mm-hmm.
And so. And so you might say, well, who cares? Because they weren't going to pay anyway. But they do pay normal taxes, right? So
Elon Musk is the single biggest taxpayer in the United States.
Yes, in history. Look, they all pull moves. Like I'm not going to defend completely, but I'm not a big fan of tax anyway. You know, there's nothing so temporary as a government tax, as Milton Friedman said, and. The reality is that the income tax was to pay for World War One. I don't know why we're still paying for World War One. So all over the world, by the way, in places that didn't even fight World War One. So but the reality is that these guys do pay taxes. Yes, they do lots of tax avoidance. They have lots of schemes and ways to avoid paying tax, like everybody should. Not evasion, but avoidance. So once you then legally have to pay X amount, you must pay X amount. But the reality is that whatever that X amount comes to for all these guys, it's now not going into the coffers of California. And the reason, by the way, the interesting reason, which intersects with what you've been talking about, the reason they wanted to raise this money is because California is short of somewhere between, I think it's $60 and $80 billion to pay for Medicare, which is medical coverage for mostly illegal immigrants.
Absolutely.
And so it's fascinating. And in fact, you know, in some ways, it doesn't matter whether Trump wins or loses, because if he wins the midterms and he carries on and he gets rid of all the illegal immigrants and he really does get rid of 15 million people and all this stuff.
So whether he wins the midterms or not, ICE is still in place.
He's still going to do that, 100%. Yes. And the big, beautiful bill carries on. But what I'm saying is if he gets to do that, then California ends up better off because they don't run into this debt. And if he doesn't get to do that, they're going to run into this massive debt and go broke at some point. You know, all of these states, you look at Tim Walz. Tim Walz, you talk about, he took over Minnesota with a surplus in that state. Billions of dollars of surplus in government funds. And he's managed to turn that, of course, into a massive, massive deficit, billions in deficit. And I think that all of this is going to be really, really interesting. It's why American politics is so interesting, is because there's all these moving parts and these facets, and change is possible, one way or the other, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. But it's such an interesting experiment, again, in going, we're going to tax the rich, as if this isn't the 400th time this has been done in history. And what do the rich do? They get up and leave, because why would they stay and be stolen from if they have a choice, right? Everybody would move if they could. And so it really is a fascinating thing to see. Should we move a little bit into anywhere else in the world? Is there anything else on your mind? I think that's a very, very heavy, great American Empire-centric part of the podcast.
I think that we're seeing lots of rumbles from many parts of the world to try and crack down on the free flow of information.
Yeah.
And you have these discussions that are ongoing, particularly between the UK and Europe and Australia, Canada to some extent, to try and clamp down on
one app only.
On X.
On
Yes.
X.
Yes.
Because that is the only one that essentially doesn't listen to, I suppose, the West's version of political correctness.
But again,
the things you're allowed to say.
When we're using the West now, we have to be very clear that it's actually like Team Europe as opposed to Team America in terms of the West. And
well, in some respects, although we must remember that the people who used to run Twitter and banned all the people they wanted to ban and made sure you couldn't say certain things about flu viruses, etc., those people were Democrats. They're on the American left. Those were not Europeans. Although you cannot really separate the two.
Yes.
You could easily take a New York congressperson Democrat, like occasional Cortex. You could take her and you could put her into...
I see what you did there.
Any European... Did you really? You could put her into any European parliament and she would be very at home with the policies and the approach of those countries. But yes, I hear you. It is at this stage very much a European. It seems like Keir Starmer is desperate, in fact, to clamp down on X. A lot of the grooming gang stuff that's come out, even the transcripts from the commission they did into that, and those came out on X. They basically didn't come out anywhere else. They were pretty much either blocked or just kind of subdued in other media forms, but very loud on X. And I think basically, that these governments that are doing bad things and are bad for their people have to shut up people from talking. And it's just fascinating to watch. I'm sure our government will try. I find it a bit humorous that years ago when Twitter was kind of the voice of the left-wing liberal journalists in South Africa, and they wanted to bring in laws to clamp down on platforms like Twitter. The ANC didn't like it at the time. They fought against it. Now, of course, they hate that platform, but because they fought against banning it before, it's a bit hard to ban it now. I think that's a little bit of irony and some good karma. So that is an interesting point. Do you think they'll get it right?
No, I think that this is so. All of these countries, they are collapsing economically. They have, in the context of their own electorate, their support levels are such that if Keir Starmer ran for election tomorrow, he would lose by a landslide. If Macron had an election tomorrow, he would lose by a landslide. I don't know what the scenario is with regard to Australia. I haven't been following that particular...
I can give you some pretty good insight on Australia. I follow their politics relatively closely. Australia's got a very similar setup to the UK. So they have Labour and Liberal, and Liberal is essentially the Conservatives, classical Liberals, essentially, what they're meant to be. And then Labour is what you've currently got with Albanese. And the issue you have is that really when you look at them on paper, they don't do anything different from each other. So the only big difference with the Liberals in Australia is that they have been very good on immigration. So when they're in power, there really hasn't been a lot of illegal immigration. Before, sure, and I'm going to forget names, but before the last Liberal government, there was a Labour government, and there was a habit of Vietnamese and Philippine and these types of ships, fishing boats essentially, arriving within sort of 15 nautical miles of the Australian coast. And then all the people on board throwing their passports overboard. And the Australian Coast Guard coming and fetching the ship because it's now in Australian waters, and they've maybe said, well, our engine has failed or whatever it is, and they now fetch these people and they bring them onto Australian shores. And under the Labour government, they go, well, where are you from? Where's your passport? No, I'm claiming refugee status. I'm not from anywhere. I don't have a passport, And under that government, basically thrown into a Holiday Inn, very similar to what they do in the UK. Put them into a Holiday Inn or similar. They give them like $30 stipend a day, so it's quite a fair amount of cash. And yeah, they pretty much stay there and have a paid for life. and then they slowly integrate them into the country. They bring them in, and they ultimately end up as residents and then sometimes citizens. The Liberal governments have been quite good there in stopping that kind of stuff. So under the previous one, those boats would arrive and they would literally tow them back into international waters. Much against lots of kicking and screaming from the lefties. So they've been quite good on that. But on a lot of the other policy, they kind of do the exact same thing as each other. Or what will happen is the left-wing government comes in, passes some sort of ridiculous law that is clearly an overreach, or clearly socialistic. And then the new guys come in, and while they don't necessarily pass any more laws like that, they don't reverse any of it. Right. And so that's kind of hamstringed Australia quite a bit, because they keep having these backwards, and they do rotate relatively often, but they keep having these backwards governments that's kind of set them back. Then some logical people come into power and they do a little bit better for a while, but they don't remove any of the barriers that have been put up in place. And so they keep making things a little bit worse. Other thing that's happened in Australia broadly is that they transitioned from a resource-based economy to a service economy in the past 20 years. That's been very successful for them, because that's what's built cities like Sydney, Melbourne. That's what gives you that skyline in Sydney, all those big banks and, the Hong Kong look. But the problem is this big question around the service industry. What service are you actually providing? Like, what value do you actually give?
I don't believe in the service economy.
Neither do I. But and what they've done simultaneously is they brought into the whole sort of climate change, environmental side of things, and so mining has been severely restricted in Australia. Nuclear development of nuclear power severely, in fact, completely stopped dead. And to the point that you've got, companies that were heavily invested in Australia now moving into areas like South America, mining companies. Because they've just made it similar to South Africa, not as bad, but in a similar way, they've just put up too many legislative barriers. And so the guys look at it and go, it just costs too much to do business here. It's just too painful. Thanks, keep it, And yeah, it's a bit unfortunate, because Australia, while it has grown quite well, and obviously it is a first world country and it sort of maintains itself in that sort of space, and it's made everyone middle class and all those things. From my perspective, and yes, I'm an outsider, but from my perspective, from what I've looked at, they could really be flying. They could be doing what the United States is doing with their growth currently, because there's just so much potential on that continent. And in that country. All right, should we finish it off a little bit at home, I guess?
So we also need to talk about the fact that while all of this stuff has been going on, we've been so focused on the U.S., Kiev has been without power now for a few days, and it's in the dead of winter, and no one seems to be really talking about it to any extent. At the same time, Mercedes-Benz has announced that they are returning to Russia, and they are reestablishing production within that country. What do they know that we don't know?
Can I try guess? Just guess. This is just me piecing things together. Remember when I said the Venezuela operation had led to changes elsewhere in the world?
Yes.
And there was something interesting that happened the other day, which is that Russia used hypersonics for the first time in this war. There's debate around the whole hypersonic thing I don't want to really get into now, but they used intercontinental regional missiles, I think, in Ukraine. It was essentially a hypersonic missile. They shot at Kiev. Excuse my pronunciation. And I looked at that and I said, and this was not long after the Venezuela stuff. And I looked at that and I said, why are they doing that? Like, what's happened? And I think there's been quite a shift. There's two things from my perspective that have taken place. One is the Americans have sort of said, we can kind of take anyone out at any time, and maybe your weapons will work and maybe they won't, because the weapons that were meant to protect Maduro were Chinese and Russian. Okay, and specifically the anti-aircraft, the close-range anti-aircraft stuff is Russian. So if you're Putin, you're now going, did they just get someone to turn those things off, the conspiracy? Or do they actually have a way to jam our stuff? And what the hell? That's not meant to be possible. Okay, so if you're Putin, you're looking at it from that perspective. As well as Venezuelan oil has kind of now been, it's not necessarily cut off, but you may have difficulty accessing it if you upset a certain man with an orange complexion in the White House. And so I think for Putin, he looks at it and goes, okay, I have to close this thing out now. I have to get to an end point. I think that's put him under pressure, in my opinion. I don't know if I'm just, those are the pieces I'm putting together to make that. It's also winter, as you point out. And winter's when you want to win this war. Because summer becomes a bit more of an equal footing. And so I think he's trying to accelerate things so that he's at the best possible place as he can see it in Ukraine when he finally has to go to the negotiating table in probably the next 2 to 3 months with Trump and say, okay, fine, I'll call off the war, but I've taken all of this territory up to this point. Kiev has been under siege for 40 days. Because I have all this power, I will withdraw to this point instead of having less than that and having to give up more, if that makes sense. And so that's what I think's happened. You're the Russia expert, though. So
I don't claim to be a Russia expert, but certainly, in terms of the geography of Ukraine, I think it's very likely that Putin is going to continue to ensure that Odessa gets taken, and I think that he has a very strong, almost emotional need to take Odessa, simply because of the fact that it is a Russian city founded by Catherine the Great, and it is the only port that's really left to Ukraine. And if he takes control of that, he effectively turns Ukraine into a landlocked country. I don't believe he has any interest in Kiev whatsoever.
No, I don't think he has any interest in Kiev.
And the reason for that,
but Kiev is a bargaining chip.
You see, it goes back to the earlier question that we were discussing around occupation versus regime change. And occupation actually works in the context of Ukraine because the people of the East are effectively the same people as the Russian people. Yes, they've over the past 30 years, they've grown in different directions to some extent. But fundamentally, at the most basic level, they speak the same language. And, they have the same classical literature. And all of those things count for a lot. It's kind of like what happened with the unification of East Germany and West Germany. Again, coming from entirely different political viewpoints, but fundamentally, when you get down to brass tacks, they're still Germans. And I think that all of the parts of Ukraine that are majority Russian-speaking, I think that Putin is not going to stop until he has taken those, unless he's given a reason to stop. And it's very clear, Trump has actually tried to stop the conflict at the current lines. And the reason why Trump has not been successful is because the Europeans have insisted on continuing to fund the war. So Trump has basically said, I'm not sending American money out here. If you want American weapons to go there, yeah, by all means, American weapons can go, but you, Europe, have to pay for these American weapons. But at the same time, you have all of these rumblings now within Europe. So, obviously, Hungary was, one of the first to say we don't want to be sending money out there. Poland has been very clear that they don't want to be getting further involved in funding this war. You've got Giorgia Meloni now also saying that she doesn't want to be part of any of these crazy plans that are coming from Ursula von der Leyen. So I don't think that your 3-month scenario is likely to happen. I think what's likely to happen is that Europe is going to continue digging its heels. Trump is not prepared at this stage to have a fight with Europe on this particular matter. I think he's very happy to have a fight with Europe around Greenland. And I think that that's where his attention is going to be. But in the meanwhile, I think that Putin is going to pretty much consolidate his positioning in terms of Ukraine. Bringing it then closer to home. Okay, your thoughts on the naval exercise?
Well, my first thought is that it's a joke, right? I made this. I made this
joke. We don't have
I made
Navy
this
to
comment
speak of.
on X. You know, someone had posted something to the effect of, Iran, Russia, China are joining South Africa, bringing their ships for a naval exercise or something. And my response to it was, "What are we bringing? The seawater?" Because we do not have.
We don't have a navy.
We don't have a navy. We've got people that we pay to be in the navy, and they occasionally go out on ships. But we have very few we have very few working ships, and there is a lot of debate amongst the military experts, certainly, whether any of those ships are actually, while they may work in terms of you can drive them out of the harbour and then kind of steer them back in, they are probably not in any shape or form ready to go to war. So they're not battle ready, which means you don't have a navy. And we know we don't have an air force. I think 3 functional helicopters and like 2 Gripens or something, which is an absolute joke. So I don't. It's just hilarious, right? It's all cosplaying, right? It's the same as like when you see our politicians stand up and rah Venezuela and imperialism and what. It's just like, guys, it's not a computer game. Like, it's real life. Like, so everything they do is hilarious. It's just like a bit of a joke. It's like they've gone and got costumes, and then today they're playing the role of the Colombia the Venezuelan like communist, and tomorrow we're going to play the game of like being a sailor on a boat, playing war games, and it's like, it's hilarious. Of course, what subsequently happened is that the Iranians allegedly have pulled out. The claim is that we asked them because it's politically sensitive. I don't believe that's true at all.
No, I
We've
don't believe
never
it's true
cared
either.
about political sensitivity, especially with regards to Iran.
Yeah, I think it's far
Okay.
more likely in this particular context that it's all hands on deck now for the Iranians. and
Yeah,
they've
I think the
decided
Iranians
to
are
pull out.
genuinely scared that they may have a toppled government. And so playing war games in the South Atlantic right now is not exactly their idea of a good time, while there are literally government buildings on fire in Tehran and across 100 cities across Iran, with potential US military strikes incoming. So, I think that that's probably what's happened. I think it's a real non-entity. That's the other thing, is just as a life concept, personally, I look at things and go, am I going to get bang for my buck here? Like, I'm going to do X. How much risk is involved? If there's a large amount of risk, is there a large amount of reward? Like, most people should have that kind of calculation with their decisions. And in a South African context, we've got a government that doesn't know how to do risk calculations or doesn't care. So I look at it and go, it's a real non-entity. Yeah, they can play games in the ocean for a couple of days. Nobody really cares. It doesn't really matter. It makes no difference. It doesn't tick the needle anywhere, one way or another. But it will be noticed by the Americans we're trying to get a trade deal with. And it will be noticed by some of the European countries who are less friendly to us. And so if they liked us as a 6 out of 10 before, maybe it's a 5.5 now. It's just a silly thing to do. There just is no return on it for us. And if we had said to the Russians and Chinese and Iranians, listen, we're not keen on this whole war game thing because we're trying to deal with geopolitics right now and who loves us and hates us. We still love you guys. Don't worry. We're still going to sell our country off to you, to Chinese. And don't worry, Iran. We're still going to funnel money to you and to Hamas and whatever for you. It's all good. But we just don't want to play war games. None of those guys would have been upset with us. They would have been fine. They don't care. They're just using us. So it's just very, very silly. It just shows another aspect of how stupid and thoughtless our government is, even to their own detriment on their own things they're trying to achieve. Because even
But
if
what are they trying to achieve? Because what if the business model is to eventually get us into a position where South Africa is sanctioned and forced to close itself off from the rest of the world, which then effectively leaves the ANC in power to do pretty much whatever it wants to within the context of South Africa and turn us into another Venezuela, effectively?
that might be the business model. The problem with that is that
Because frankly, I can't see anything else that actually makes
as
sense.
the
at
reason
this
for
point.
it. Okay, so if that's the theory, it's fine, but I'm going to give you a counter theory, which is that firstly, you're not really going to achieve that by playing war games with idiots, okay? Because it doesn't move the needle enough. Like America will look at that, they'll be annoyed, but they're not going to sanction us over that, okay? It's not big enough. It's too small an event. It's the same as when a Russian fighter jet overflies an American frigate. It's a problem. They don't like it to happen, but it doesn't lead to World War III. And so you just got to understand so yes, maybe that's part of the business plan. I think there's an entirely another business plan taking place.
Oh, yes.
Which I think the ANC has no control over. I think that the reason the rand is so strong to the dollar has nothing to do with dollar weakness. I think that somebody, and many people, in fact, are pricing in the next election. I think they know something we don't, which is that the balance of power is going to shift from roughly 75-80% ANC, 20-25% other parties to a 50-50 split or less for the ANC. I think they're banking on most of that 50% going to the DA or other parties who can be manipulated to be technocratic bureaucrats. And I think they're factoring that in. And they're assuming we're going to become a European liberal democracy. And that's what's being priced into the rand. That's what I think's happening. And again, I have limited evidence for that, but I have seen no other reasonable explanation for why the rand dollar is doing what it's doing. So,
well, ties in with our last conversation around what's likely to happen in Johannesburg. And yes, it all depends on whether, yes, I believe Helen Zille will win, but will she get more than 50%?
unlikely.
No.
Last thing, Iran,
Yes.
because we've mentioned it, but we haven't mentioned what's going on in there.
Yes.
The media hasn't mentioned much of it,
Yes.
which is quite fascinating. I saw today some Australian media reported that 200 protesters had been killed by government forces, but they were quick to say after they made that statement that they'd had no corroboration and no evidence for those numbers or those claims. It's funny how when things happened in Gaza, they didn't need corroboration from the Hamas health ministry, but now they need corroboration. Very interesting
Gaza Health
journalism.
Ministry, yes.
Yeah, very interesting journalism. But just broadly, there are protests across Iran. This is not the first time this has happened, which is why I'm a little less hopeful, perhaps, than some people are. There have been protests before. I don't know if anyone remembers the meme from 6 years ago. A woman standing up, holding her hijab in her hand. It was the woman who stood on the power box by the bus station.
Yes.
And was disappeared for doing that. But it resulted in protests across Iran at the time with women taking off their hijabs in protest. That was quelled. There were subsequent protests in Iran a couple of years back which were also quelled on university campuses. And now we've got this. This seems to be bigger than anything we've seen in recent years. But these are unarmed civilians working against what is essentially a security state.
Yes.
And they're already arresting thousands, allegedly have arrested as many as 10,000 people. I don't know if that's true, but it's a number I read. It may not be true, but they've certainly arrested many, many people. Definitely people have been shot and killed in the street for protesting. And they've already convicted a whole bunch of people for illegally protesting or whatever the charge was and intend to hang these people in the public square in the next couple of days. What do you think is likely to happen here? Or what are the possible outcomes?
I don't have enough information.
Yeah.
there's just so much smoke and mirrors right now around this particular conflict. Nearly every video that I see emerging from both sides is doctored or manipulated in some way or the other. For example, today there were these videos that were put out by the Iranian regime, basically saying, showing hundreds of thousands of people gathered at a particular spot, and it turns out that that's an old photograph from the time of the execution by previous Trump administration of Soleimani. So we have a dearth of information, and which makes it really difficult to gather what's actually going on the ground level. I think my assessment of Iran over the course of observing the way in which that society actually manages itself, and again, not having actually ever been to the country and not being able to see what it's like on the ground, you get a substantial body of evidence that comes from people who have fled the country and in terms of what they speak about. And at the same time, you also have people within the country who have been interviewed fairly substantially, but some by people within our country as well. And the pieces of the puzzle that you get together is that in as much as you have a state that very clearly is subject to the whims and fancies of the clerical class, there isn't a situation within Iran where there is the same hatred for the administrative class, shall we say. So in other words, you have a layer of the Iranian society that is elected at some level, but at the same time, their ability to actually have real power is greatly minimized by the whims and fancies of the clerical class, which is why, I said, but again, this goes back to the years of Ruhollah Khomeini, where I said that if you're able to get the clerical class out of Iran, in other words, if you remove the Ayatollahs, then I think that the people of Iran, by and large, actually will have the ability to fit themselves once again into the family of nations. Now, the question is whether what is currently going down in Iran is likely to lead to the removal of Khamenei and his acolytes. I don't see a clear path to that happening, which is what makes it.
I do see a clear path.
Yeah.
It's just one that would. It's a controversial one. The clear path is to assassinate them.
So, taking that particular point of view, I would agree with you that that would be the clear path. However, assassinating him in this particular context is not as easy to do as extricating Maduro. Simply because unlike Venezuela, so you've probably seen the figure quoted that the Venezuelan military had something like 2,000 generals.
Yeah.
Okay, which is more generals than all of the Western forces put together. Iran doesn't operate at the same level. Iran is, the entire military complex in terms of Iran is highly efficient. And so the ability to actually take out the Ayatollah, and again, let's be very clear. I don't think neither of us are actually advocating assassination in this context.
No,
Okay.
I'm just saying it's one of the routes to that.
Yes,
but we could be gone.
Yes, and we're really looking at.
The danger with doing something like that, obviously, is that you create a martyr of someone like that.
So I don't think that's as much of an issue right now, because again, it goes back to the question of would the Americans do strikes? I think it's one thing for Trump to do a strike on a nuclear facility with a very specific target of taking it out, And I think that certainly most Iranians themselves would see the logic in it and would not see it as an attack upon the civilian population. On the other hand, is it possible to actually take out the leadership of Iran without massive civilian damage? I don't think so. And I don't think that in the current context that that's something that Trump is likely to do.
No,
Yeah.
I agree. It's a pity, though, because Iran is a country with a lot of potential, firstly, a lot more than it currently is able to have. The people there are definitely persecuted. The country is relatively isolated. And the people that run the country are not good for the world. They do bad things. They sponsor bad things. They pay for bad things.
Well, it's because they have the ability to issue fatwas which are not subject to democratic process.
Yeah, I'm against fatwas, even which ones which were democratic. So I'd be against both. But yes, you're right. I think the reality
fatwas that are subject to democratic process are what are called laws, and again, laws are only entirely dependent.
Laws usually do not go after individuals. They go after either a collective. So, for example, a cartel.
Oh no, I disagree with you. Just look at the FBI's most wanted list. They said the law certainly goes after individuals.
Yes, because those individuals broke general laws.
So, again, let's not split hairs around the terminology.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that there is no way for the average Iranian at a political level to be able to override what Khamenei comes up with.
Okay. And we have Jimmy Carter to thank for that. So if you want to go read into the history of how Iran got this way, it's basically all Jimmy Carter's fault. Much of the world's problems, by the way, are Jimmy Carter's fault. I've been diving quite deep into that, and it's quite impressive how far Jimmy Carter moved the needle of the entire world towards this sort of socialist hellscape. But for another time, because we're out of it.
Do you have any happy thoughts to close this off? Because, a lot of what we've been talking about.
Well, I think from my perspective, Donald Trump is the antidote to a lot of the mistakes a person like Carter and people after him perpetuated for 40, 50 years. And, I think that there is this freak out happening about the change of the global world order and the challenge to it. And I think there's nothing to freak out about it. So far, I have seen nothing happen in the world in the past year that I think is an ultimate negative. I'm talking about large events. What's happened in Venezuela, ultimately, I think will be net positive. What's happening in Iran hopefully will be net positive. Even if it isn't net positive now, it will be net positive eventually, because these things tend to build. And so you can stop a revolution today, but you ultimately cannot keep it at bay forever. Certainly not one being fermented in the way the Iranian one is. The changes in sort of political movement and domination in terms of what's happening with militaries. A lot of these things are very, very positive. To some extent, China's being put back in a box. So there is a lot of actually good stuff. While it looks bad on the face of it, there's a lot of really good stuff happening. And the sort of outcomes, the endpoints of a lot of these things are going to be very good for the world as a whole. That's my positive thought.
And you're not moving to Greenland?
Well, if they're offering $1 million per person, I might just become a citizen of Greenland sooner than later. But I don't think it'll be $1 million. I think it'll be somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 per person. Which is still nothing to be you have your nose turned up at. But with the rand recovering to 10 to the dollar.
10 to the dollar?
It wouldn't. We're not getting there just yet, but it's very interesting where we are and where we're going. And yeah, if anyone's got theories, because as I've said, some of the stuff I've said on the show is just kind of me piecing things together and based on
But
intuition.
that's pretty much what we do. You know, it's
Sure.
It's making an informed decision with incomplete information.
Yes, very often. Although, as you've said with Iran, don't know because not enough data.
Not enough data, yeah. And
all right. Good. So once again, thank you to everyone who watches us, who listens to us. This time you might have noticed that Kanthan has switched to that side of the table and I'm on this side.
I decided I'm going to be the right wing for once.
He's on the right wing for once, also because his cable for his laptop over there plugs into a plug more easily. And as always, we thank you for watching and listening. If you enjoyed the show, please do share, like, subscribe, and all that good stuff.
And my hair might be gone by the next episode.
Gone? What do you mean gone?
Well, I'm waiting for it to grow to 25
This
centimeters.
is the biggest controversy. Why don't we start with this?
I need it to grow to 25 centimeters so I can then donate it to the Cancer Society.
Oh, you're one of those people.
Well, that's what happened last time.
You're a good person, Kanthan. All right.
All right.
And on that note, thank you, and we'll catch you next time. Cheers.
Cheers.